My name is Evan Carter, and I was 28 when the events I'm about to recount happened. To this day, I haven't set foot in the woods again, and I doubt I ever will. This all took place in the dense forests of Hocking Hills State Park, Ohio, during a weekend camping trip meant to be a celebration. Instead, it turned into a nightmare that still haunts me every time I close my eyes. The idea came from Haley, my friend Jordan's girlfriend. Haley had just wrapped up her first photography exhibit, and she wanted to celebrate by capturing the natural beauty of the Ohio wilderness. Jordan was all for it, and I saw it as a chance to reconnect with my younger sister Beth, who had been distant ever since she moved back to town. So, the four of us packed up for a weekend of camping. It was late October, and the leaves had turned fiery shades of red and orange. The drive to Hocking Hills was pleasant enough, filled with Haley's excitement about capturing perfect long-exposure shots of the night sky and Jordan's usual sarcasm. Beth sat quietly in the back seat, clutching her silver necklace, a family heirloom she never went without. We arrived at the trailhead around mid-afternoon. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the chatter of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. We hiked for an hour before finding a secluded clearing near a stream. It was perfect, or so I thought. As we unpacked, I realized I'd forgotten the poles for the tent. "Damn it," I muttered, kicking myself for the oversight. Jordan laughed it off, as he always did, but Beth was visibly uneasy. Haley suggested we make do with the tarps we'd brought, and we rigged up a makeshift shelter using trees and rope. By the time the sun began to set, we were sitting around a small fire, eating canned chili and trading stories. Haley couldn't stop talking about the photos she planned to take. "This place is amazing," she said, adjusting her camera. "I can't wait to see how the stars look tonight." Beth remained quiet, her eyes darting toward the tree line. "This place feels off," she said softly, "like we're not supposed to be here." "Come on, Beth," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "It's just a forest." It started small. The bird song that had been constant earlier in the day vanished as the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest grew eerily silent, save for the crackling of our fire. While gathering more firewood, Haley called out, "Hey, guys, look at this." We walked over to find her kneeling by the stream, pointing at footprints in the mud. They were human-like but elongated, with clawed toes. "Probably a bear," I said, though I didn't believe it. Jordan laughed nervously. "Yeah, a bear that walks on two legs. Totally normal." Beth looked pale. "We should leave," she whispered. I waved her off. "It's nothing. Let's just enjoy the trip, okay?" But deep down, I felt it too. That creeping sense that we were being watched. As the night deepened, Haley busied herself with her camera, setting up long exposures. The rest of us sat by the fire. That's when we heard it. The sound of my voice calling out from the darkness. "Help!" Jordan sat up straight. "Evan, was that you?" My stomach dropped. "I'm sitting right here." The voice came again, louder this time but distorted, like it was coming through a broken speaker. "Help me!" Beth clutched her necklace tightly. "That's not you," she said, her voice trembling. "It's someone messing with us," I said, grabbing a flashlight. "Stay here." I stepped into the trees, shining the light in all directions. The beam landed on a figure about 20 yards away. It looked like me, but wrong. Its proportions slightly off, its movements jerky and unnatural. My breath caught in my throat as it turned its head, its eyes reflecting the light like an animal's. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. When I returned to the fire, I didn't tell the others what I'd seen. I didn't want to scare them, or myself. The next morning, things got worse. Beth's necklace was missing. and we found it hanging from a branch deep in the forest. Haley's camera, which she'd left outside, had been moved, its lens shattered. Beth refused to leave the campsite, muttering prayers under her breath. Haley, ever the adventurer, insisted on hiking to a nearby overlook for better photos. Jordan and I went with her, leaving Beth alone against her protests. As we climbed the trail, we noticed the forest seemed different. The trees were gnarled and twisted, and the air was thick and heavy, as if the forest itself was pressing down on us. Then we heard the laughter, high-pitched and childlike, echoing through the trees. "Kids?" Haley said, confused. "Out here?" Jordan shook his head. "No way, not this far in." We quickened our pace, but the laughter followed us, growing louder and more mocking. By the time we reached the overlook, we were all on edge. Haley snapped a few photos but kept glancing over her shoulder. I was about to suggest we head back when Jordan froze. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing to a ridge across the valley. Standing there was a figure, gaunt and pale, with elongated limbs. It moved in sharp, unnatural jerks, like a marionette. Haley raised her camera, but the creature vanished before she could take a shot. "Let's go," I said, my voice tight. The hike back was a nightmare. The laughter returned, joined by whispers that sounded like our own voices. The forest seemed to shift around us, the trail disappearing and reappearing in ways that defied logic. When we finally made it back to camp, Beth was gone. Panic set in as we searched the area, calling her name. We found her near the stream, standing motionless. When I touched her shoulder, she turned to face me, her eyes vacant and unseeing. "She's mine now," a voice whispered, though no one else was around. Beth collapsed into my arms, shaking violently. I carried her back to camp, but she wouldn't speak. She just stared into the fire, clutching her necklace. That night, the skinwalker came for us. It stood just beyond the firelight, its twisted form visible in flashes as it circled the camp. It spoke in Beth's voice, then mine, then Jordan's. Each time it sounded more human, more convincing. "It wants one of us," Beth finally said, her voice hollow. "A life for a life." I argued with her, but Beth was resolute. She believed it was her fault for bringing the necklace, for ignoring the warnings she claimed to have felt from the beginning. While the rest of us slept, or pretended to, Beth disappeared. When we woke, she was gone. The forest was silent again, and the air felt lighter, as if whatever had been stalking us was satisfied. We hiked out in a daze, haunted by what we'd seen and heard. When we reached the car, Haley checked her camera. The last photo she'd taken showed the four of us standing at the overlook, only there were 5 figures in the frame. The 5th figure stood behind us, pale and gaunt, its hollow eyes staring directly at the lens. Beth was never found. Search parties combed the area but came up empty. Haley and Jordan broke up not long after, and I stopped camping altogether. Sometimes, late at night, I hear Beth's voice calling to me from the woods outside my window. I don't know if it's real or if my mind is playing tricks on me, but I'll never answer. The forest can keep its secrets. I want no part of them. My name is Ava Reynolds, and I'm 27 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened last summer during a camping trip in Mohican State Park, Ohio. I don't know if I'll ever step foot in the woods again after that trip, or sleep soundly, for that matter. It started as a plan for a fun getaway, a 3-day camping trip with my best friend Carter, his co-worker Jason, and a girl named Emily who Carter had been crushing on. I wasn't sold on the group dynamic. Jason could be a little much, and Emily was a wild card, but Carter had always been my rock during trips like this. As an ex-Boy Scout, he could handle anything the outdoors threw at him, and I trusted him to keep things on track. We left in Carter's old SUV, towing his second-hand RV behind us. Emily had brought a leather-bound journal filled with local legends and stories about the forest. She kept flipping through it as we drove, stopping every now and then to read aloud. "Have you guys heard of skinwalkers?" she asked at one point. Her voice was soft, almost reverent, like she was sharing a secret. "Skin what?" Jason asked, half laughing. "They're shapeshifters," she explained, brushing a strand of black hair behind her ear. In Navajo folklore, they're witches who can take the form of animals, or even people. They mimic voices to lure you into the woods. Jason snorted. "You really believe that stuff?" "I think there's truth in all stories," Emily replied calmly. Her dark eyes flicked to Jason, who rolled his eyes and muttered something about paranoid nonsense. We reached Mohican State Park in the late afternoon. The main campground was buzzing with families and RVs, so Carter led us to a secluded trailhead he'd scouted online. After about an hour of hiking, we found a clearing by a narrow creek and decided to set up camp. Jason was in charge of the tents, but it quickly became clear he'd skimped on quality. The cheap nylon fabric sagged and the zippers stuck, but he insisted it would be fine. I could see Carter's jaw tighten, but he didn't say anything. That first night, the forest seemed alive. The chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves made me feel at ease. We cooked hot dogs over the fire and told stories, mostly light-hearted ones. Jason's bravado melted a bit when it got dark, and Emily's calm presence seemed to balance things out. Then, just as we were about to turn in, the sounds of the forest stopped. It was sudden, unnatural. One moment there was a symphony of insects and frogs, the next, silence. We all noticed it. Emily's hand froze mid-flip of her journal, her face going pale. "What the hell?" Jason whispered, looking around. "Probably just a predator nearby," Carter said, trying to sound reassuring. "Animals get quiet when there's something bigger around." But his voice was tight, and I could tell he didn't believe it. The next morning, we woke to find bare human footprints around our campfire. They were strange, larger than any of ours, with toes that ended in claw-like points. Jason laughed it off. "Some hillbilly messing with us," he said, though he avoided looking at the tracks for too long. Emily, on the other hand, was visibly shaken. "We should leave," she said, clutching her journal to her chest. "We're not cutting the trip short because of some prank," Jason snapped. "Besides, we're in the middle of nowhere. Who's going to find us out here?" Reluctantly, we packed up camp and continued deeper into the forest, following the creek as our guide. Jason insisted on leading, despite his terrible sense of direction, and by midday we realized we were lost. The creek had forked, and Jason had chosen the wrong path. "Nice job, Lewis and Clark," I muttered, glaring at him. Jason shot me a look but didn't respond. His confidence was cracking, and it was clear he didn't want to admit it. By late afternoon, we stumbled upon a makeshift marker, a bundle of twigs and animal bones tied together with twine, hanging from a low branch. It swayed gently in the breeze, and a chill ran down my spine. "Okay, that's messed up," I said. Emily's face was pale. "It's a warning," she whispered. "We're not supposed to be here." Jason scoffed, but even he didn't look entirely convinced. That night, we camped in another clearing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every crack of a branch made me jump. Around midnight, Jason woke us all up, his voice shaking. "Guys, there's something out there." We scrambled out of our tents to find him standing by the dying campfire, pointing toward the tree line. "It was Carter," he said. "He was just standing there, staring at me. I turned to Carter, who was standing right beside me. "What the hell are you talking about?" Jason's face went pale. "I swear it was you." Emily clutched my arm. "We need to leave," she whispered. Carter shook his head. "Not in the dark. We'd get more lost than we already are. Let's stay put until morning." Reluctantly, we returned to our tents, though none of us slept much. At dawn, we found more tracks, human footprints that led into the woods and then vanished. Jason was gone. "Maybe he went to pee," Carter said, though his voice wavered. "He wouldn't wander off without his boots," I pointed out, holding up Jason's shoes, still by his tent. We searched for hours, calling his name. The woods felt wrong, too quiet, too still. Emily clutched her journal like a talisman, muttering under her breath. By mid-afternoon, Jason reappeared, stumbling out of the trees. "Where the hell have you been?" Carter demanded, running to him. Jason looked off. His clothes were torn and his movements were jerky, almost mechanical. When he spoke, his voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Got lost," he said simply. Emily and I exchanged a glance. Something was wrong. That night, as we sat around the fire, Jason began to mimic Carter. His gestures, his tone, even his laugh. It was uncanny, like watching a puppet master control a marionette. "Knock it off," Carter said, his voice sharp. Jason just smiled, but it wasn't his usual cocky grin. It was cold, predatory. "Jason," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's my middle name?" His head tilted slightly, and for a moment he didn't respond. Then, in a low guttural voice, he said, "Why don't you tell me?" Carter shot to his feet, grabbing the hunting knife from his pack. "That's not Jason," he said. The thing that looked like Jason let out a low, bone-chilling growl. Its features began to shift, its skin stretched. Its eyes glowed yellow, and its mouth widened into something monstrous. "Run!" Emily screamed. We ran blindly through the forest, the thing chasing us, its voice shifting between Jason's, Carter's, and even mine. "Don't leave me," it cried in my voice. But I didn't look back. Emily flipped through her journal as she ran, chanting something under her breath. The thing stopped abruptly, letting out a guttural scream that rattled the trees. We didn't stop until we reached the trailhead, collapsing in a heap by the RV. We drove to the nearest town, our nerves shattered. Jason's body was never found, and I don't think it ever will be. Carter swears he saw a raccoon with human-like eyes watching us as we left, its gaze unblinking. I haven't gone camping since. My name is Ben Foster, and I'm 32 years old. I've always been a rational guy, someone who believes in what he can see, touch, and explain. Last fall, I took a solo RV trip to Shawnee State Forest in Ohio, hoping to spend a quiet weekend hiking and decompressing from work. What happened out there in the forest changed me in ways I can barely put into words. I haven't told anyone this story until now because, honestly, I doubt anyone would believe me. But every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers again. It started like any other trip. I pulled into Shawnee in the late afternoon, towing my little RV behind my old Tacoma. The place was stunning. Rolling hills covered in a blanket of fiery red and orange leaves. I parked at a spot by Turkey Creek, far from the crowded campgrounds, and spent the first evening sitting by a fire, sipping whiskey, and enjoying the solitude. The next morning, I set out on one of the lesser-used trails, hoping to find a good view of the valley. As I hiked, the trail narrowed and the forest thickened. About 2 miles in, I spotted something strange in the distance, a small, weathered cabin hidden among the trees. Curiosity got the better of me. so I veered off the trail to check it out. The cabin was ancient, its roof sagged, and its wooden walls were gray with age. The door hung ajar, creaking slightly in the breeze. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The air was heavy, carrying a faint metallic smell. Inside, the walls were covered in strange carvings, symbols I didn't recognize, jagged and spiraling. In the center of the room was the skeleton of a deer, its bones arranged in a circle. I felt a chill creep up my spine. It was the kind of thing that screamed, "Stay out." But I told myself it was just some creepy artifact left by past hikers or hunters. I snapped a photo with my phone, then left the cabin and returned to the trail. But as I hiked back to my RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of insects and birds during the day, was now eerily quiet. As I sat by my fire, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, my ears straining for any sound. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, barely audible, like a breeze brushing through the trees. But as the night wore on, they grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unsettling. Low, raspy, and taunting. I tried to tell myself it was the wind or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me, but I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Hoof prints circled my RV. Large, deep impressions that didn't match any animal I knew. The strange part was how they moved. They weren't the wandering tracks of a deer or horse. Instead, they seemed deliberate, like something had paced around my camp all night, watching. Determined to clear my head, I decided to hike a different trail. About an hour in, I heard rustling ahead. I froze, gripping my hiking pole tightly. From the trees stepped an old man, his face gaunt and his clothes tattered. He carried a crude walking stick and had a wild, almost feral look in his eyes. "Not many folks come this way," he said, his voice gravelly. "Just out for a hike," I replied, forcing a smile. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here." He nodded slowly, his gaze sharp. "You find the cabin?" I blinked, startled. "How did you—" "You shouldn't have gone in there," he interrupted, his tone dark. "That place, it don't belong to you, it's his." "Whose?" I asked, my unease growing. The man's eyes narrowed. "The devil, he walks these woods, whispering in the ears of fools, promises them everything they want, but the price is always the same." I chuckled nervously. "That's just a story." He stepped closer, his face inches from mine. "Then why are you here, listening to his whispers?" I didn't have an answer. Before I could say anything else, he turned and vanished into the trees. That afternoon, as I tried to make my way back to camp, I realized the forest wasn't the same. The trail I had followed earlier now seemed to lead nowhere, twisting and looping back on itself. Familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by dense thickets and strange, gnarled trees. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard them again. The whispers. Only this time they were louder, closer. They called my name, Ben, stretching it out in a mocking drawl. I picked up my pace, my heart pounding. When I finally stumbled back to the RV, the door was open, though I was certain I had locked it. Inside, everything was untouched, but the air felt wrong, like someone or something had been there. That night, he came to me. I was sitting by the fire trying to calm my nerves when the flames flickered and dimmed. From the shadows, a figure emerged. He was tall, his features indistinct, as if his form couldn't fully settle. His eyes burned like embers, and his voice was smooth, almost soothing. "Ben," he said, smiling, "you've had a rough couple of days." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The air around him seemed to hum with energy, making my skin crawl. I can help you, he continued, stepping closer. You're lost, confused, but I can give you what you need. Anything you desire. I swallowed hard. What do you want in return? His grin widened. Oh, just a little thing. Your soul. I forced myself to stand, my fists clenched. Get the hell away from me. The devil laughed, a deep, resonant sound that made the trees tremble. You'll come around, he said, vanishing into the shadows. They always do. The next morning, my RV was gone. I woke to find myself lying in the dirt, the fire reduced to cold ashes. Panicked, I searched the area, but there was no sign of my vehicle. It was as if it had been swallowed by the forest. I spent the day wandering, desperate to find the road or another person, but the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, an infinite maze of trees and shadows. By nightfall, I found myself back at the cabin. The devil was waiting for me inside. This time, his form was more defined, almost human. He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, as if he'd been expecting me. Ready to talk? He asked. No deal, I said, my voice trembling but firm. He sighed, shaking his head. Stubborn, aren't you? You'll die out here, you know. Alone, cold and forgotten. Is that what you want? I thought of the hermit's warning, of the symbols carved into the cabin walls. An idea formed in my mind, desperate and reckless, but my only chance. I can't give you my soul, I said. It's not mine to give. The devil froze, his fiery eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? I straightened, summoning every ounce of defiance I had left. My soul belongs to God. You have no claim over it. For a moment, the cabin was deathly silent. Then, the devil let out a roar of rage, his form twisting and contorting. The walls of the cabin shook, and the air grew suffocatingly hot, but I didn't back down. You have no power over me, I shouted. With a deafening crack, the devil vanished, his screams echoing through the forest. The cabin collapsed around me, and everything went black. I woke up at dawn, lying by Turkey Creek. My RV was parked nearby, its door open. I didn't question it. I climbed inside, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. As I reached the edge of the forest, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There, on the back window, was a charred handprint. The whispers haven't stopped. My name is Ava Morgan, and I was 29 when I decided to take a solo trip to Shawnee State Forest in southern Ohio. I'd just come out of a nasty breakup and needed space to clear my head. Writing has always been my therapy, and I was working on a new project about America's forgotten legends. Shawnee, with its rugged beauty and tales of a 17th century witch named Abigail Crow, seemed like the perfect place to start. I'd read that Abigail had been accused of witchcraft and executed by settlers who blamed her for a string of mysterious deaths. Before she died, she supposedly cursed the land and marked certain trees with a spiral symbol. Anyone who disturbed those trees was said to meet a grim fate. It was the kind of story that gave me goosebumps and made for great writing material. So, one October morning, I loaded up my RV and headed to Shawnee, not realizing I was about to walk straight into the legend I'd come to write about. The forest was stunning, blanketed in shades of orange and gold. I found a secluded spot to park my RV, far from the few other campers. It was exactly what I wanted: peace, quiet, and the perfect backdrop for exploring. As I navigated the narrow, unpaved road to my campsite, my RV jolted hard. When I checked, one of the rear wheels had slipped into a ditch. I cursed under my breath and spent the next half hour jacking up the RV and placing rocks under the wheel to stabilize it. It worked, but the whole ordeal left me flustered. When I finally settled in, I noticed my phone had no signal. It wasn't entirely unexpected, but it still unnerved me. I was completely cut off. Just me in the forest. The next day, I set out to find the execution site where Abigail Crow had been hanged. My research suggested it was deep in the forest, near an old, overgrown trail. I brought my camera, notebook, and a basic map, which turned out to be laughably unhelpful. After an hour of hiking, I spotted something unusual. A tree with a spiral symbol carved into its bark. It was deep and precise, as if someone had gouged it in with a blade. The area around the tree was strangely silent, no rustling leaves or chirping birds. I moved closer, snapping photos. The bark felt unnaturally cold when I brushed my fingers over the symbol. That's when I noticed the ground around the tree. Plants were dead and brittle, their stems snapping like twigs under my boots. A wave of dizziness hit me, and I stumbled back. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I checked the time, nearly 3 hours had passed. It felt like I'd been there for maybe 30 minutes. I made it back to the RV just as the sun was setting. My head throbbed, and my stomach churned. Maybe I was dehydrated. I decided to rest, jotting down my notes before turning in for the night. At some point, I woke up to a strange sound outside, like footsteps crunching through the leaves. I sat up, my heart pounding. It could have been a deer or some other animal, but something about the rhythm of the steps felt human. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. The footsteps stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window. Nothing. But when I turned to sit back down, I froze. The spiral mark was etched into the inside of my RV door. The next day, I met an old hiker while trying to retrace my steps to the marked tree. He introduced himself as Edgar and gave me a once-over, his gaze lingering on the dark circles under my eyes. "You look like you've seen the witch," he said. I laughed nervously. "Not quite. Just a tree she supposedly marked." Edgar's expression turned grave. "Stay away from those trees," he warned. "They're cursed. Abigail doesn't take kindly to trespassers." He went on to tell me that people who touched the marked trees often reported strange visions and bad luck. Some claimed to see Abigail herself, a shadowy figure stalking them through the forest. I didn't tell him about the spiral on my door. I didn't want to sound crazy. That night, the nightmares began. I dreamed of being tied to a stake as a crowd of shadowy figures jeered and threw stones. Abigail was there, her face gaunt and hollow, her lips moving as she cursed me in a language I didn't understand. I woke drenched in sweat, the dream bleeding into reality as I saw her face flash in the dark corner of my RV. I tried to leave the next morning, but no matter which way I drove, the forest looped back to the same spot. The unpaved road twisted unnaturally, leading me in circles. The spiral mark appeared again, this time scratched into the hood of my RV. Desperate, I decided to return to the tree. If this was Abigail's doing, maybe I could reason with her, or at least end whatever was happening. I reached the tree just as the last light of day slipped away. The forest seemed alive, shadows shifting in the corners of my vision. I heard Edgar's voice in my head, "Offer an apology and a token of penance." I set my notebook down at the base of the tree. "I didn't mean to disturb you," I said aloud. "I'm sorry, please let me go." The air grew icy, and the shadows coalesced into a figure. Abigail. She stepped closer, her eyes like black pits, her hands charred and twisted. "You took from me," she hissed, her voice echoing. I didn't understand until she pointed at my notebook. The photos I'd taken of the tree were printed on its pages. Trembling, I tore the photos out and placed them on the ground. "Here, take them, I'll leave." She stared at me for what felt like an eternity before reaching out. Her hand hovered over my forehead. and I felt a searing pain as if she'd branded me with fire. "The land remembers," she whispered. "Tread carefully." When I woke up, it was dawn. Abigail was gone, and the spiral mark on the tree had faded. My RV started without issue, and I drove away without looking back. Weeks later, I noticed the faint outline of a spiral on my forehead, barely visible but impossible to ignore. At night, I still hear whispers, faint and distant, like Abigail is watching, waiting. I've stopped writing about legends. Some stories are better left untold. My name is Caleb Jennings. I was 35 when I took what should have been an ordinary camping trip to Salt Fork State Park in Ohio. I'm not the superstitious type. I've always loved a good ghost story, sure, but I never believed in them. That changed after what happened to me last October. And even now, I find it hard to put into words. But I'll try. This all started with my blog. I write about Ohio's state parks, their history, and the forgotten places within them. I focus on ruins, ghost towns, and abandoned structures, piecing together the stories of the people who lived there. Salt Fork State Park was next on my list, particularly an old ghost town near the lake. The settlers who lived there in the 1800s disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind only crumbling buildings and unmarked graves. It sounded like a fascinating story, so I packed up my RV for a weekend trip. I planned to explore the ruins, take some photos, and maybe stay an extra day if I found enough material. I wasn't expecting luxury, just quiet nights under the stars. I didn't realize how wrong I was. I pulled into Salt Fork late in the afternoon, parking the RV at a secluded campsite near the lake. It was the off-season, and I was the only camper there. Perfect. The autumn air was crisp, the trees a mix of orange and gold, their reflections shimmering on the lake. Everything seemed fine until I went to turn off the engine. The RV sputtered, coughed, and then died completely. I fiddled with the ignition, but it wouldn't start again. I told myself it was fine. I could call a tow service the next day if needed. For now, I had enough supplies to stay put. I shrugged off the unease creeping up my spine. Mechanical issues happen, no big deal. The next morning, I set out to find the ruins. Armed with a map I'd printed from a website, I followed a narrow trail through the woods. But the farther I walked, the more disoriented I felt. The trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches forming almost a tunnel overhead. The map wasn't much help. It showed the ruins near the lake, but no matter how far I went, they didn't appear. After nearly 2 hours of wandering, I finally stumbled across them. The crumbling foundation of a house, its stones overgrown with moss. Nearby, there were smaller structures barely recognizable as barns or sheds. I started taking photos, documenting the eerie beauty of the place. That's when I noticed something sticking out of the ground near one of the ruins. At first, I thought it was just a rock, but as I dug around it, I realized it was a doll. It was old, weathered, its face cracked and burned. Its eyes, though faded, seemed to follow me no matter where I moved. A chill ran down my spine as I held it, but I shoved it into my bag anyway. It would make a great addition to the story. As I made my way back to the RV, things started to feel wrong. At first, it was subtle. The woods grew unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps. Then I started hearing whispers. They were faint at first, like the wind brushing through the trees. But the farther I walked, the louder they became. Words I couldn't quite make out. "Hello," I called, my voice breaking the stillness. "Is someone there?" No answer. just more whispers swirling around me, growing closer. I broke into a jog, heart hammering. When I finally reached the RV, I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it for good measure. My chest heaved as I tried to convince myself it was nothing. The wind. My imagination. But then the lights flickered. I spent the rest of the day trying to get the RV to start, but it was no use. I was stuck for the night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt the silence pressing in again. I lit a lantern and sat down to review the photos I'd taken. At first, they seemed fine. Images of the ruins, the forest, the doll. But as I scrolled, I noticed something strange. In one of the shots, there was a figure in the background. It was faint, almost translucent, but unmistakably human. A woman in a tattered dress, her face obscured. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. That's when I heard it. A knock on the RV door. It was soft, hesitant, but impossible to ignore. "Who's there?" I shouted, grabbing the nearest thing I could find for protection, a wrench. No answer. Just another knock, louder this time. I opened the curtain and peered out. Nothing but darkness. The whispers started again, louder now, circling the RV like a storm. I backed away, heart racing, as the lights flickered again and finally went out. I spent the night in the dark, clutching the wrench, jumping at every sound. The whispers never stopped, and at one point I heard faint laughter, a child's giggle coming from outside. By morning I was exhausted, but the sunlight gave me enough courage to leave the RV. I needed to figure out what was going on. I decided to revisit the ruins, hoping to find some logical explanation. Instead, I found a journal tucked into one of the crumbled walls. Its pages were brittle, the writing barely legible. It belonged to a settler, and the entries told a horrifying story. An outbreak of disease had ravaged the town, killing most of the residents. Those who survived turned on each other, blaming one another for the deaths. The final entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting. "The dead won't rest. We're cursed. Stay away from the graves." As I read the journal, I heard splashing from the lake. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but when I looked, I saw them. Figures in the water, pale and skeletal, their eyes glowing faintly. They bobbed just below the surface, watching me. One of them raised an arm, pointing directly at me. I ran. That night, the spirits came for me. I was inside the RV when it started shaking violently, as if something or someone was trying to tip it over. The whispers were deafening now, joined by pounding on the walls and roof. I grabbed the doll from my bag, desperate to do something, anything to stop it. "Is this what you want?" I shouted, holding it up. The pounding stopped. The air grew still, but the whispers didn't fade. Instead, they coalesced into a single voice, deep and guttural. "Give it back." I flung the doll out the window, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then, from the darkness outside, I saw them. The figures from the lake, emerging from the trees. They moved slowly, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I panicked, throwing open the RV door and running. I didn't stop until I reached the park's entrance, where I collapsed in the dirt, gasping for air. The tow truck arrived the next morning. The driver found me sitting by the entrance, clutching the journal. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer explanations. When I reviewed the photos later, the figure in the background was gone. But in its place, every shot of the ruins had faint, shadowy faces, dozens of them watching from the edges. I never finished that blog. The journal sits on my shelf, untouched, and I still see the doll sometimes. In my dreams, floating in the lake. Its cracked face watching me. I haven't gone camping since. Some stories are better left untold. My name is Sarah Whitaker, and I'm 29 years old. This happened last fall, just a few months after my boyfriend and I broke up. I needed to get away from everything: work, friends, even family. I told myself a solo camping trip in my RV would help clear my head, give me time to think. I've always loved photography, so I picked Conkle's Hollow in Ohio, a place I'd read about for its steep cliffs and dense, colorful woods. I thought it would be peaceful. I thought it would heal me. Instead, it became a nightmare I still can't escape. I reached the park in the late afternoon, parking my RV at one of the less crowded lots near the preserve. The air was crisp, filled with the smell of fallen leaves, and the golden light of the setting sun made the forest look almost magical. It was exactly what I needed. I spent the evening setting up a small campfire and reviewing my plan for the next day. The gorge was supposed to be breathtaking, and I wanted to get some good shots for my portfolio. As I flipped through my guidebook, I came across a section about local legends. Stories of settlers, tragic accidents, and ghostly sightings in the area. I skimmed over them, too tired to care much about folklore. That night, the forest was silent, unnaturally so. I lay in bed in the RV, listening for the usual nighttime sounds: crickets, owls, the rustling of leaves. But there was nothing. Just an oppressive stillness that felt wrong. I told myself it was my imagination, the isolation playing tricks on me. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I grabbed my camera and set off into the gorge. The trail was narrow and steep in places, but the views were stunning. Towering cliffs on either side, trees ablaze with autumn colors, and the faint sound of water trickling in the distance. About an hour in, I came across a park ranger. He was older, with a lined face and a no-nonsense air about him. "Careful out there," he said, tipping his hat. "Steep drop-offs, and some parts aren't marked too well." "I'll be careful," I replied, adjusting the strap of my camera. He hesitated, then added, "You hear about the kids?" "The kids?" "Couple 100 years back, a settler family got lost out here, mother and 3 kids. Father went for help, but they didn't make it. Folks say the kids still wander the gorge, crying for their mama." I laughed nervously, not sure how to respond. Is that supposed to scare me back onto the main trail? The ranger's face stayed serious. "Just don't go off trail. And if you hear anything, don't follow it." By the time I reached the end of the trail, I'd forgotten the ranger's warning. I was too focused on capturing the perfect shot of the sunlight filtering through the trees. But when I reviewed the photos on my camera, one of them made my stomach drop. In a frame of the forest, there was a blurry figure, small, pale, and distinctly human-shaped, standing among the trees. I frowned, zooming in. It had to be a trick of the light, I told myself, maybe a reflection or a glitch. I deleted the photo and tried not to think about it. That night, as I sat in my RV editing photos, I heard it. Faint, high-pitched giggling, like children playing outside. I froze, my hand hovering over the trackpad. The sound was soft, but unmistakable. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, shining the beam into the trees. "Hello," I called, my voice shaking. There was no answer. But when I stepped down onto the ground, I saw them. Small handprints smeared in the dust on my RV's window. The next day, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe a family had passed by the campsite without me noticing. The handprints could have been old, left behind at a previous stop. Determined to shake the unease, I set off on another hike. This time, I avoided the gorge and stuck to a shorter loop trail. The forest felt darker, even in the daylight, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. It happened again that night. I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when the lights in the RV flickered. Then the radio turned on, blasting static at full volume. I scrambled to shut it off, my heart racing. As I fumbled with the dials, I heard the knocking. Soft at first, then louder. 3 deliberate taps coming from the back of the RV. Grabbing my flashlight, I forced myself to open the door. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside. No one was there. But lying on the ground by the steps was a doll. It was old, its fabric body stained and its porcelain face cracked. I stared at it for a long moment, then picked it up and hurled it into the woods. The next morning, I drove to the park office, desperate for answers. The same ranger from before was there, and I told him everything: the photos, the handprints, the noises, the doll. He listened silently, his face grim. "You're not the first," he said when I finished. He told me the full story of the settler family. The father had left them to find help, but a storm rolled in and he never returned. The mother and children died of exposure, their bodies found weeks later at the base of a cliff. Ever since, visitors to the gorge had reported hearing voices, seeing children, or feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness. "They're stuck," the ranger said. "Lost and looking for someone to take their place." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, but the terror in his eyes was real. "You should leave," he added. I nodded, but I wasn't ready to give up. That night, the children came for me. It started with the knocking again, louder this time, shaking the RV, then the giggling, echoing all around me. When I opened the door, they were standing there, 3 of them, pale and translucent, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They looked like normal kids at first glance, but their movements were wrong. Jerky, unnatural, like marionettes on strings. "Come play with us," the smallest one said, her voice high and sweet. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. "Leave me alone." The children's faces twisted, their smiles stretching too wide. The air grew heavy, and the RV began to shake violently. Desperate, I grabbed my camera and started snapping photos. The flash seemed to disorient them, their forms flickering like static on a broken TV. But it didn't stop them. They advanced, their voices merging into a haunting wail. "You can't leave us," they cried. "We're so lonely." I bolted, running blindly into the woods. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, the trees closing in around me. Their laughter followed me, growing louder and louder until I thought my ears would burst. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the laughter stopped. I found myself standing by the ranger's station, trembling and covered in scratches. The ranger helped me inside, gave me water, and listened as I babbled about what had happened. When I showed him the photos, they were blank. Just black frames, as if the camera had never fired. He didn't seem surprised. "You're lucky you got out," he said. I didn't argue. I drove out of Conkle's Hollow that morning, not stopping until I was miles away. But as I reached the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The doll was sitting on the back seat, its cracked face turned toward me. My name is Evan Green, and I was 29 when this happened. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Just me, my 2 friends, Ava and Josh, and a borrowed RV we nicknamed the Beast. We went to Salt Fork State Park in Ohio, drawn by its sprawling woods and quiet trails. Josh had insisted we camp near Bigfoot Ridge. He thought it would be hilarious to spend the weekend hunting cryptids, even though Ava and I weren't sold on the idea. Looking back, I wish I'd refused. I still have nightmares about what happened out there. We arrived on a warm Friday afternoon, the kind of day that tricks you into thinking the world is safe and bright. The RV rattled and groaned as we drove into the campsite, Josh laughing and blasting music while Ava rolled her eyes at his antics. Ava, 28, was the voice of reason between us. She'd just gotten out of a bad relationship and wanted a peaceful weekend in nature. Meanwhile, Josh, 30 and loud as ever, had packed every piece of junk gear imaginable, but somehow forgot essentials like extra batteries and a map. The campsite itself was nestled in a hollow near Bigfoot Ridge, surrounded by tall trees that swayed in the wind. It felt secluded, almost too much so. The RV sputtered to a stop, and Josh jumped out, grinning as he gestured to the woods. "Behold," he announced. "Bigfoot's backyard. Let's make some history, folks." Ava groaned. "Let's just set up before it gets dark." I started unloading gear while Josh wandered off to scout the area. Ava and I exchanged a look. We'd both known Josh for years, and his impulsiveness was something we tolerated more than enjoyed. Still, he had a way of lightening the mood, and we could all use a break. That first evening was uneventful, almost peaceful. We cooked over the fire pit, told old stories, and laughed more than we had in weeks. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods grew unnervingly quiet. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves faded into a heavy silence. "Do you hear that?" Ava asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What?" Josh said, poking at the fire. "Exactly." "Nothing. It's too quiet." I shrugged it off, but something about the stillness gnawed at me. We stayed up late, joking and talking, but the unease lingered. When we finally turned in, I made sure to lock the RV's doors, though I couldn't say why. The first strange thing happened the next morning. I woke early, planning to make coffee before everyone else stirred. Stepping outside, I nearly slipped on something in the dirt. Looking down, I saw footprints, barefoot, human-like, but wrong. The toes were too long and faint claw marks trailed behind each step. "Josh!" I called, irritated. "Stop messing around." He stumbled out of the RV, bleary-eyed. "What are you yelling about?" "These," I said, pointing to the prints. His face went pale. Not me, dude." Ava joined us, squinting at the tracks. "Maybe it's an animal, like a bear?" "No way," Josh said, shaking his head. "Bears don't have feet like that." We all fell silent, staring at the prints. They led away from the RV and into the woods, disappearing into the underbrush. I tried to shake off the creeping dread, chalking it up to some weird animal. But Ava looked uneasy, and even Josh didn't have a joke. The day passed with more tension than fun. Josh suggested hiking off trail to look for Bigfoot, but Ava and I shot him down. Instead, we stuck close to the campsite, gathering firewood and exploring the nearby trails. The unease from the morning lingered, though none of us said it out loud. That evening, as we sat around the campfire, the forest came alive with sound. Twigs snapping, branches rustling, as if something was circling us. Josh tried to laugh it off. "Probably just deer," he said. "Relax." But then we heard it, a voice calling from the woods. "Help! Help me!" It sounded distant, almost muffled, but here's the thing. It was Josh's voice. We all froze. Josh looked at me, wide-eyed. "What the hell?" "It's an echo," he said after a moment. But his voice wavered. Ava shook her head, her face pale. "That's not an echo. That's something else." The voice called again, closer this time. "Help me!" It was identical to Josh, down to the tone and inflection. Ava grabbed my arm. "Evan, we need to go inside, now." We locked ourselves in the RV, the fire outside crackling in the darkness. For hours, we sat in tense silence, listening. The voice came and went, moving around the campsite. Sometimes it was Josh's voice, other times mine or Ava's. Each time it sounded wrong. Too hollow, too perfect. Around midnight, the tapping started. Soft at first, then louder. Something was tapping on the RV's windows, moving from one side to the next. When I finally worked up the nerve to peek, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, Josh made the mistake of looking out the back window. He stumbled away, his face ashen. "It's me," he whispered. "I saw me." Ava started crying. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "We're staying inside," I said. "Whatever's out there can't get in." I wanted to believe that. By dawn, the noises stopped, and the forest was silent again. We emerged cautiously, squinting in the gray light. That's when we saw the scratches on the RV door. Deep gouges, like something with claws had tried to force its way in. Josh was done. "We're leaving," he said, throwing gear into the RV. "I don't care what's out there, I'm not staying another night." We all agreed. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. No amount of coaxing or swearing could bring it back to life. "Great," I muttered. "Now what?" Josh suggested hiking out to find help, but Ava refused. "We don't know what's out there," she said. "We're safer here." The argument escalated. Tension had been simmering all weekend, and now it boiled over. Josh accused Ava of being paranoid, while she called him reckless. I tried to mediate, but it was no use. Finally, Josh stormed off. "Fine, I'll go myself. You two can sit here and wait for Bigfoot to eat you." "Josh, don't," I started. But he was already gone, disappearing into the woods. The hours crawled by. Ava and I sat in the RV, jumping at every noise. I wanted to believe Josh would be okay, but deep down, I knew better. As afternoon turned to evening, the tapping started again, this time louder, more insistent. Something heavy slammed against the RV, rocking it on its wheels. And then we heard Josh's voice. "Guys, let me in, it's me." Ava grabbed my arm. "It's not him, don't open the door." The voice grew more frantic. "Come on, guys, please." I hesitated, my hand on the lock. Then I heard it, a second voice, faint but distinct. "Help me." It was Josh again, coming from the woods. Ava whispered, "Evan, it's tricking us." I stepped back, my heart pounding. Whatever was outside wasn't Josh. It wasn't human. The creature revealed itself just after sunset. It smashed through a side window, its hand reaching inside, long fingers tipped with claws. Ava screamed, and I grabbed the only weapon I could find, a cast-iron skillet. I jammed it into the fire, heating it until it glowed red, and swung at the hand. The smell of burning flesh filled the RV, and the creature let out a guttural screech, retreating into the night. For the rest of the night, we stayed locked in the RV, too afraid to sleep. The creature prowled outside, its glowing eyes watching us through the broken window. It didn't try to break in again, but its presence was enough to keep us paralyzed with fear. By morning, the creature was gone. The RV started as if nothing had been wrong. We drove out of the park in silence, too shaken to speak. As we left, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It looked like Josh, smiling and waving goodbye. But I knew it wasn't him. We never saw Josh again. His body was never found. To this day, I can't bring myself to go camping, and I never speak about what happened that weekend. But sometimes, late at night, I hear tapping on my window, and I wonder if it's still out there waiting. My name is Lila Parker, and I was 32 when I decided to spend a week alone in Mohican State Park. I needed the quiet. My divorce had finalized 6 months earlier, and even though it was what I wanted, the aftermath was heavier than I'd expected. I was tired of hearing, "You're so strong," and "You'll bounce back." The truth was, I didn't feel strong. I felt untethered. Camping alone in my old RV had become a kind of therapy. There was something grounding about being in nature, away from the noise of everyday life. I'd done solo trips before, but none quite like this. Mohican was beautiful, but remote, with dense forests and winding trails that could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. I picked a spot near the Clear Fork River, a place tucked away from the main campground. I wanted solitude, and I got it. Or so I thought. The first day was uneventful. I parked the RV in a clearing by the river, close enough to hear the gentle rush of water. I set up camp quickly, then spent the afternoon reading and journaling. The air smelled like wet earth and pine, and for a while, I felt the peace I'd been craving. That night, a thunderstorm rolled in. I was inside the RV, scribbling in my journal, when the first crack of lightning lit up the forest. The rain came fast, drumming against the metal roof in an unrelenting rhythm. I noticed a leak in the corner of the ceiling, just a steady drip onto the kitchenette counter. I grabbed a bowl to catch the water, annoyed but not surprised. My RV was old and temperamental, much like me. The generator flickered a couple of times, then sputtered out entirely. The interior plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, cursing under my breath. Rain lashed against the windows and the wind howled like a living thing. I tried to convince myself it was cozy, a storm, a flashlight, the perfect setting to lose myself in a book. But the truth was, it felt oppressive, like the storm was pushing against me, trying to force its way inside. I woke the next morning to gray skies and muddy ground. The storm had turned the trails into sludge and the river had swollen, its currents angry and fast. I decided to stay close to camp. Hiking would have been a mistake in that weather. Around noon, while walking by the river, I noticed something strange. Small footprints in the mud. They were barefoot, child-sized, leading away from the water and into the woods. I stopped, my heart doing a weird little skip. I hadn't seen anyone else since arriving, and these prints were fresh. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the trees. No answer. The tracks ended abruptly at the base of a massive oak tree. I looked up, half expecting to see someone hiding in the branches, but there was nothing. Just the soft creak of the wind moving through the forest. I tried to shake it off. Maybe a family had been camping nearby and the storm had washed away the rest of the trail. It was a logical explanation. But as I walked back to the RV, I couldn't help feeling like I was being watched. That evening, I was sitting outside watching the river glow orange in the fading light when I saw her. A woman standing on the opposite bank. She was pale, almost glowing, and wore what looked like a long white dress. Her hair hung in damp strands over her shoulders. "Hey!" I called, standing up. "Are you okay?" She didn't move, didn't even look in my direction. I stepped closer to the river, squinting through the dim light. Then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she was gone. One moment she was there, the next she wasn't. I stood there for a long time staring at the empty bank. A chill crept up my spine and I forced myself to go inside. I locked the RV door and drew the curtains, but it didn't help. The image of her lingered, etched into my mind. That night, I woke to the sound of crying, faint, high-pitched like a child's sobs. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from outside near the river. "No," I whispered to myself, "no way." But the crying didn't stop. It was constant, heartbreaking, and impossible to ignore. I grabbed my flashlight and cracked the door open, peering out into the darkness. The beam of light caught nothing but trees and shadows, but the crying was louder now, insistent. "Hello?" My voice wavered. Is someone out there? Silence. Then a laugh, soft and breathy, like a child giggling. My stomach dropped. I slammed the door shut and locked it, backing away as the laughter grew louder, circling the RV. Something slammed against the side hard enough to make the walls shake. My flashlight flickered and the air inside the RV felt suddenly colder, as if the storm had crept in. The next morning, I found scratches on the RV door. Long, deep gouges that hadn't been there before. My journal was open on the kitchenette counter, though I was sure I'd left it closed. Words were scrawled across the pages in a jagged script that wasn't mine. Help me, find them. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew better. There was no one else out here. Whatever was happening, it wasn't natural. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I saw the woman again. She was standing by the river, her back to me, the hem of her dress trailing in the water. This time, I didn't call out. Instead, I watched as she turned slowly to face me. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her mouth moved as if she were speaking, though no sound came out. She raised one hand pointing toward the woods. I don't know why I followed her. Maybe I was in shock. Maybe I was too scared to think straight. I grabbed my flashlight and trailed her into the trees, my boots sinking into the mud with every step. She moved effortlessly, her figure flickering in and out of sight. The trees opened up to reveal a clearing, and in the center stood an old, crumbling cabin. The roof was caved in, and the wood was gray with age. The woman stopped at the doorway, turning to look at me one last time before disappearing into the shadows. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, reeking of damp earth and rot. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, shards of glass, and something else. Small bones, scattered like leaves. My flashlight caught the edge of a photograph pinned to the wall. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. The photo was faded, but I could make out the image of a woman, her dress identical to the one I'd seen, and two small children standing beside her. Their faces were blurred, as if the photograph had been smudged by time or something worse. A sudden noise made me spin around. A low, guttural growl coming from the corner of the cabin. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I saw it. A dark, hulking figure, its eyes glowing red. It stepped closer, and I stumbled back, tripping over the debris. The thing lunged, and I barely made it out of the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. I ran back to the RV, my lungs burning, the forest around me alive with the sound of footsteps that weren't mine. Back in the RV, I locked the door and barricaded it with everything I could find. The creature followed, slamming against the walls, shaking the vehicle like it was a toy. I clutched my journal, flipping through its pages in desperation. The words, "Help me." Find them stared back at me, and I realized what I had to do. Grabbing a handful of rocks from the riverbank, I built a small cairn near the edge of the water. I added wildflowers, muttering a prayer for the lost souls. As I placed the last stone, the noise stopped. The air grew still, and for the first time in days I felt the oppressive weight lift. I turned to see the woman in white standing a few feet away. She smiled faintly, her hollow eyes softening, and I saw two small figures appear beside her. They stood there for a moment, then faded into the mist. I left Mohican the next morning, the RV's engine miraculously starting without issue. As I drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw it. A small handprint pressed into the fogged glass of the window. I still can't explain what happened in those woods, but I know one thing. Some places don't forget, and some spirits never stop searching. My name is Lisa Carter, and I'm 36 years old. This happened 2 summers ago in July. when my husband, our 2 kids, and I decided to take a road trip in our RV through Ohio. It was supposed to be a chance to reconnect as a family, but it turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. We were headed to Wayne National Forest, a sprawling, picturesque area Derek had read about online. They've got hidden waterfalls and trails nobody's ever heard of, he'd said with his usual enthusiasm. My husband is the kind of guy who loves veering off the beaten path, literally and figuratively. It's one of the things I loved about him when we met, but lately it just felt reckless. I had agreed reluctantly. A few days in the woods wouldn't kill me, right? I was wrong. We arrived at Wayne National Forest late in the afternoon. The main campground was busy, full of families and groups enjoying the summer, but Derek wasn't interested in setting up where everyone else was. He insisted we head to a more secluded area he'd found on a map. We'll have peace and quiet, he promised. Against my better judgment, I went along with it. After navigating narrow, rutted dirt roads, we finally stopped at a clearing far from anyone else. The kids, Mia, who's 12, and Toby, who's 7, bounded out of the RV, excited to explore. The spot wasn't bad, I'll admit. Towering trees surrounded us and a small creek trickled nearby. It was tranquil in the way only deep woods can be. But almost immediately things started going wrong. The RV's generator sputtered out that night, leaving us with only flashlights and the glow of the fire Derek had built. I was annoyed, but kept my mouth shut. No use starting an argument. The kids bickered endlessly as usual, with Mia teasing Toby about being afraid of the dark. Derek brushed it all off, saying, "This is what camping's about, roughing it." I didn't sleep well that first night. The woods were too quiet, and I mean unnaturally quiet. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant hoots of owls. Just nothing. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. The next morning, Derek suggested we hike to a hidden waterfall he'd read about. It wasn't on any official map, but he swore it was just a short trek from our campsite. I protested. "Why can't we stick to the marked trails? It's safer," I said. He rolled his eyes and accused me of being overly cautious. Mia was on his side, of course. She loved the idea of an adventure. Toby, on the other hand, clung to me, saying he didn't want to go. "It's okay, buddy," I assured him, though I didn't believe it myself. "We'll be back before you know it." We set off around mid-morning, Derek leading the way with a map he'd printed off some obscure website. The trail quickly grew faint, and before long we were bushwhacking through undergrowth. Mia found it thrilling, but I felt a growing unease. The deeper we went, the more unsettling the forest became. Strange markings appeared on the trees, crudely carved spirals and stick figure shapes. Derek dismissed them as graffiti from bored hikers, but they didn't look recent. And then Toby found the figurine. It was lying near the base of a tree, half buried in moss, a small wooden carving about 6 inches tall of a child holding hands with a towering, distorted figure. The craftsmanship was crude but unnerving. "Can I keep it?" Toby asked, his wide eyes fixed on the doll. "No," I said quickly. "Leave it." Derek laughed. "It's just a little carving, Lisa. Let him have it." Toby held on to it, and I tried to push down the unease gnawing at my gut. That night, the whispers started. We were sitting around the fire when I heard them for the first time. Faint, almost indistinct, but definitely there. A chorus of voices, murmuring in a language I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I noticed Mia's face pale. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Derek claimed he didn't, but I saw the way his eyes darted to the trees. The whispers grew louder as the night went on, and Toby started acting strange. He sat by the fire, clutching the wooden figurine, muttering under his breath. When I asked him what he was saying, he looked up at me with glassy eyes and said, "She's coming." "Who's coming?" I demanded, but he just shook his head and looked away. The next morning, Derek and I argued. I wanted to pack up and leave. "Something's not right here, Derek," I insisted. "Toby's acting weird, and those whispers—" "It's just your imagination," he said dismissively. "We're not cutting this trip short because you're spooked." That was when Mia came running out of the RV, panic etched across her face. "Toby's gone!" We found him a few hundred yards into the woods, standing in a clearing with his back to us. He was barefoot, his pajamas soaked with dew. "Toby!" I called, rushing to him. He turned slowly, and I swear for a moment his eyes weren't his own. They were darker, emptier. "I was following her," he said. "Following who?" Derek asked, but Toby didn't answer. He just clutched the figurine tighter. By the third night, the whispers were constant. They circled the campsite, growing louder and more insistent. Shadows flickered at the edge of the firelight, and I felt like we were being watched. Derek tried to stay calm, but even he couldn't deny it anymore. "Maybe we should leave in the morning," he admitted. But we didn't get the chance. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of Toby crying. I bolted upright and saw the RV door swinging open. He was gone again. Derek grabbed a flashlight, and we ran into the woods. The whispers were deafening now, overlapping and echoing in every direction. And then we saw her. The witch. She stood at the edge of the clearing, impossibly tall and gaunt, her limbs too long and her face a hollow mask. Her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness as she reached for Toby, who stood frozen in place. "No!" I screamed, charging forward. Derek tried to follow, but he was thrown backward by an unseen force, slamming into a tree. I grabbed Toby and yanked him away, clutching him to my chest as the witch let out an inhuman shriek. We stumbled back to the RV, Derek cradling his arm, which was clearly broken. "We're leaving now," I said, my voice shaking. But the RV wouldn't start. The generator sputtered, the engine refused to turn over, and we were trapped. The whispers grew louder, the shadows closing in. Toby clung to me, sobbing, while Mia stared wide-eyed at the flickering fire outside. "Burn it," she said suddenly. "Burn the doll." I didn't question her. I grabbed the figurine from Toby's hands and threw it into the flames. The wood hissed and cracked, releasing a thick black smoke that carried an ear-piercing wail with it. The shadows recoiled, and the whispers fell silent. For a moment, everything was still. At dawn, the RV finally started. We left Wayne National Forest without looking back. Derek's arm was broken in 2 places, and Toby wouldn't speak for days. Even now, he wakes up screaming sometimes, saying, "She's coming." We never told anyone the full story. Who would believe us? But I know what I saw, and I'll never set foot in those woods again. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. My name is Melanie Harper, and I'm 34 years old. 2 years ago, I embarked on a solo RV trip through Ohio, searching for hidden trails and untouched beauty to photograph for my travel blog. It was supposed to be a journey of healing after my divorce, a way to prove I could survive, thrive even on my own. I wanted to find peace, but what I found in Blue Ash Hollow was something far darker. I'm writing this now, not for closure, but as a warning. If you ever hear the name Blue Ash Hollow, stay far away. The trip had been uneventful until I stopped at a small gas station near the edge of the hollow. The attendant, a hunched woman with thin wiry hair, gave me an odd look as I paid for my coffee. "You headed toward the hollow?" she asked, her voice scratchy like old vinyl. I nodded. Thought I'd camp there for a night. Looks like a great spot for photos. Her lips tightened and she leaned in. "Nothing good grows there. Folks who go into that place, and they don't always come out the same." I forced a laugh, brushing her off with a polite, "Thanks for the warning." But her words lingered as I drove the narrow dirt road into the forest. The entrance to Blue Ash Hollow was unmarked, a gap in the dense trees where the dirt path narrowed and darkened. My RV's engine sputtered and groaned as if reluctant to proceed. Finally, it gave one last cough and died altogether, leaving me stranded in the shadow of towering blue ash trees. "Perfect," I muttered, grabbing my toolkit and stepping out into the oppressive quiet. The air was heavy, damp with the scent of earth and decay. My boots crunched against fallen leaves as I opened the hood, but I couldn't find anything obviously wrong. Frustrated, I set up my small campsite a few yards from the RV. I figured I'd fix the engine in the morning when I wasn't so tired. The sunlight filtered weakly through the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I told myself it was just my imagination. It always was. As the evening crept in, I wandered with my camera, snapping shots of the eerie, blue-tinged ash trees. Their bark shimmered faintly, as though imbued with some unnatural glow. When I reviewed the photos later, the trees looked darker, almost black. The shimmer was gone, replaced by faint smudges, shapes I hadn't seen while taking the pictures. Shapes that looked disturbingly like faces. That night, I sat by the fire trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. The silence was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just stillness. It felt wrong, but I told myself it was part of the forest's charm. Then I heard it. Faint giggling, high and childlike, carried on the wind. My stomach tightened, and I turned toward the sound. "Hello?" I called, my voice sharper than I intended. No response, just the fire crackling in that oppressive silence. "Get a grip, Melanie," I muttered, retreating to my RV. I locked the doors and tried to sleep, but my dreams were filled with strange, shifting images. Children's faces half hidden in shadows, crude symbols carved into trees, and the faint sound of humming. The next morning, I awoke to find my camera equipment scattered outside. The lens was cracked, and the memory card was missing. My stomach churned as I noticed something else. Symbols scratched into the side of my RV, circles intersected by jagged lines. They matched the ones from my dream. I wanted to leave, but the RV's engine refused to start. I tried calling for help, but there was no signal. With no other option, I decided to explore the hollow, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could help. I didn't get far before I saw them. 2 children standing at the edge of the trail. A boy and a girl, both pale and dirty, their clothes torn and faded as if they'd been wandering for days. "Are you okay?" I asked, approaching cautiously. The boy, who looked about 10, nodded. "We've been lost. Can you help us find our family?" The girl, younger and smaller, clung to his side, humming a soft, lilting tune. Her wide eyes met mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Of course," I said, though something about them felt off. "Do you know where they might be?" The boy pointed toward the deeper woods, near the cabin. "What cabin?" He didn't answer, just turned and started walking. The girl followed, still humming, her voice hauntingly beautiful. I hesitated, but my instincts told me I couldn't leave them alone out here. Against my better judgment, I followed. The forest grew darker as we walked, the trees closing in around us. The air felt heavier, colder, and the silence was broken only by the girl's incessant humming. My heart pounded as I realized I didn't recognize any of the landmarks anymore. It was as though the woods were shifting, rearranging themselves to trap us. After what felt like hours, we came upon the cabin. It was small and dilapidated, with a sagging roof and walls covered in moss. It hadn't been there moments before, I was certain of it. "This is where we live," the boy said, his voice eerily calm. The girl giggled and tugged at my sleeve. "Come inside, it's safe." I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run. "I think we should stay out here," I said, my voice trembling. The boy's expression darkened. "You don't want to make her angry." "Who?" I asked, my throat dry. Before he could answer, the door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. The girl's humming grew louder, and I stumbled back, the ground seeming to tilt beneath my feet. "I'm sorry," the boy whispered. "We don't have a choice." I turned and ran, my legs burning as I sprinted through the woods. The children's voices followed me, echoing in the still air. "You can't leave," they called. "It won't let you." Branches tore at my skin, and the ground seemed to shift beneath me, but I didn't stop. Finally, I burst into a clearing and collapsed, gasping for breath. When I looked up, I was back at my RV. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Symbols were carved into the dirt around the vehicle, the same intersecting circles from before. And standing just beyond the tree line were the children, their faces blank and eyes empty. "You can't leave," they said in unison. "Not until she's fed." Desperation took over. I grabbed a rock and scratched one of the symbols into the dirt, mimicking the ones I'd seen. The children screamed, their voices shrill and inhuman, and the forest seemed to ripple around me. Shadows darted between the trees, and a low, guttural growl rumbled through the air. I didn't stop. I scratched another symbol, then another, until the growling faded and the children disappeared. The forest fell silent once more, and the oppressive weight lifted. The RV's engine started on the first try. I didn't look back as I drove away, the hollow receding in my rearview mirror. I made it to the nearest town and called for help, but when I returned with a mechanic, the symbols on the RV were gone, and the gas station clerk swore she'd never heard of Blue Ash Hollow. Even now, I'm not sure what happened in that place. I only know that I'll never go back. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint humming outside my window, and I know the hollow hasn't forgotten me. My name is Ryan Cooper, and I'm 28 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened 2 years ago during a weekend camping trip in Hocking Hills State Park, Ohio. I never imagined I'd survive something like this, and sometimes I wonder if I even did. It feels more like a waking nightmare I can't escape. It was Maya's idea to head to Hocking Hills. She was always the adventurous one, always looking for new trails and hidden spots to explore. She was 27, and her energy could light up a room, or an entire forest. Luke, the loudmouth of our group at 29, was her polar opposite. He liked to prove he was the smartest guy in the room, even when no one was competing. Then there was Jamie, the quiet one. She was 25, analytical and practical to a fault, but I could tell from the beginning she didn't want to be there. She only came because Maya convinced her it'd be fun. Me? I went because I was tired of the grind. Same desk, same job, same stagnant life. This trip was supposed to be a break, a way to reconnect with the people who mattered most. We arrived late on a Friday, our rented RV lumbering down the narrow dirt road to Whispering Pines Trail. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. The isolation hit me as soon as we parked. There was no cell service, no hum of civilization, just the forest, stretching endlessly in every direction. "Man, this is perfect," Luke said, slapping the side of the RV, "just us and the wilderness." Jamie muttered something about how remote it was, but Luke brushed her off. "Come on, Jamie, relax. This is what camping's about." We set up our tents a few yards from the RV and built a fire. The night started off great, laughing, roasting marshmallows, swapping old stories, but something shifted around midnight. The laughter died down, and we sat listening to the crackling fire. That's when we first heard it. A low, guttural growl from somewhere in the woods. "What the hell was that?" Jamie asked, sitting bolt upright. "Probably just a raccoon," Luke said, though even he looked a little uneasy. Maya shrugged. "Could be a deer, or maybe a coyote." But it didn't sound like a coyote. It was too deep, too unnatural. We all went to bed eventually, though I had trouble falling asleep. The sound played over and over in my mind. The next morning, we decided to hike deeper into the woods. Maya had read about an off-the-map rock formation that sounded cool, and Luke was all for it. Jamie hesitated, but Maya's enthusiasm won out. The forest was beautiful, with sunlight streaming through the trees, but the deeper we went, the quieter it got. By noon, the birds had stopped chirping, and even the rustling of leaves seemed muted. That's when we found it. A massive rock, half buried in the earth with strange carvings etched into its surface. They looked like human figures, all thin and distorted, with long limbs and antlers growing out of their heads. "Whoa," Luke said, running his hand over the carvings. "Creepy." Jamie shivered. "We shouldn't be here." "Oh, come on," Luke said. "It's just some old graffiti." "It doesn't feel old," Maya murmured, her eyes fixed on the rock. She looked different. Her usual excitement was gone, replaced by something darker. Fear, maybe, or fascination. We moved on, but the mood was off. Even Luke stopped joking around. By the time we got back to camp, the sun was setting, and the forest was starting to feel oppressive. That night, the growls returned, closer this time. And then, around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the tents. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, until they stopped. The next morning, we found strange footprints around the campsite. They were barefoot but oddly shaped, with long, narrow toes. Luke laughed it off, calling it a prank by another camper, but Jamie wasn't buying it. "There's no one else out here," she said. "I checked the trail logs." Maya didn't say much. She looked pale and tired, like she hadn't slept at all. She picked at her breakfast, muttering about how hungry she was, even after finishing her share. We decided to explore one more trail before heading back. Luke insisted we return to the rock, but Jamie flat out refused. I sided with her, and we ended up wandering a new path instead. That's when everything went to hell. It started with Luke's disappearance. One moment he was walking ahead of us, laughing about something stupid, and the next he was gone. His flashlight and backpack were lying on the ground, but there was no sign of him. "Luke!" Maya shouted, her voice echoing through the trees. "This isn't funny." We searched for hours, but there was no trail, no sound, nothing. As night fell, we had no choice but to return to camp. Maya was furious. Jamie was terrified, and I felt like something was watching us. Back at camp, Maya's behavior got even stranger. She ate everything we had left, then complained she was still starving. Her eyes looked hollow, and she kept glancing at the woods like she was expecting someone or something. "Are you okay?" I asked her quietly. "I'm fine," she snapped, then softened. "Sorry, I feel weird." Jamie pulled me aside later. "She's not fine, Ryan. Something's wrong with her." "I know," I said. "But what the hell are we supposed to do?" That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard it again, the growl louder than ever. And then I saw it. A gaunt figure standing just beyond the firelight. Its eyes glowed faintly, and antlers framed its skeletal face. My blood turned to ice as it took a step closer, its elongated limbs moving unnaturally. "Maya," I whispered, shaking her awake. "Do you see that?" She opened her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she looked like it, her face thin, her eyes too wide. Then she blinked, and it was just Maya again. "I don't see anything," she said, but I could tell she was lying. The next morning, I made the call. "We're leaving. Now." Maya argued, but Jamie backed me up. We packed up the RV as quickly as we could and started the drive out. But the forest didn't want to let us go. The road seemed longer, the trees closer, and the shadows darker. Maya started mumbling under her breath, something about hunger and whispers. Jamie looked at me, her face pale. "She's not okay," she whispered. And then Maya snapped. She lunged at Jamie, screaming, her nails clawing at her face. It took all my strength to pull her off. Her eyes were wild, and her teeth, they looked sharp, too sharp. "Get out of here," I shouted at Jamie, shoving her toward the door. Maya turned to me, her voice low and guttural. "You can't leave. It won't let you." She charged at me, but I grabbed the emergency flare from the dashboard and lit it. The bright red light made her recoil, and for a moment I thought I saw antlers sprouting from her head. She let out a guttural scream and ran into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. Jamie and I made it out, but we were never the same. We told the authorities about Luke and Maya, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no bodies, nothing. The official report called it a tragic accident, but I know better. Sometimes, late at night, I hear growls outside my apartment, scratches on the window. And when I dream, I see antlers in the dark. It didn't let us go. My name is Grace Whitman, and I'm 33 years old. This happened last summer when I was researching a true crime case for my podcast. What I thought would be a routine investigation turned into something far darker than I could have imagined. To this day, I still don't know if I uncovered the truth, or if the truth uncovered me. I'd been following the story of Sarah Clay for months. She was 17 when she vanished near Salt Fork State Park in Ohio. Her car abandoned in a parking lot, her belongings untouched. Her case was cold, but littered with strange rumors. Whispers of occult rituals, sightings of strange figures in the woods, and talk of a place the locals called the Devil's Crossing. The stories fascinated me. Salt Fork had always been a hotspot for urban legends, but Sarah's case was different. There was evidence, fragments of her life left behind, and I was determined to find answers. I arrived at the park on a sweltering July afternoon, parking my RV in a secluded spot near the edge of the woods. It wasn't the first time I'd camped alone for research, but something about this trip felt different. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive, as if the forest itself was watching me. That first evening, I visited a nearby diner to interview locals. Most were reluctant to talk, brushing off Sarah's disappearance as a tragic but ordinary case of a teenager running away. But Danny, a jittery waitress with wide eyes and nervous hands, had a different story. "You're looking for the Devil's Crossing, aren't you?" she asked in a hushed voice, glancing around as if someone might overhear. I froze. "How do you know about that?" "It's where Sarah went," Danny whispered. "Everyone knows, but no one wants to admit it. People go there to make deals, you know. You don't come back the same, if you come back at all." I tried to press her for more details, but she shook her head, her face pale. "Just stay out of the woods after dark," she said before hurrying away. The next morning, I met Sheriff Don Harlan, a grizzled man in his late 50s with a permanent scowl. I'd left him a few voicemails before arriving, hoping he'd be willing to talk about Sarah's case, but his reception was icy. "Whatever you're looking for, I suggest you stop," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "This ain't the kind of story you want to tell." "I'm just trying to find out what happened to her," I replied. "You won't," he said, locking eyes with me. "Some things don't have answers. Not the kind you want to hear anyway." His words lingered as I left his office, but they only strengthened my resolve. If no one else was willing to confront whatever was hiding in those woods, I would. That afternoon, I hiked into the forest, following the faint trail Danny had described. The air grew cooler as I walked, the sunlight dimming beneath the canopy. After an hour, I found it. A clearing marked by a ring of weathered stones. In the center was a charred patch of earth, as if a fire had burned there long ago. Surrounding the stones were strange symbols carved into the trees, spirals, jagged lines, and shapes that looked like eyes. At the edge of the clearing, something glinted in the dirt. I knelt and unearthed a small rusted locket, its chain broken. Inside was a faded photo of a young girl, Sarah. A chill ran down my spine as I slipped the locket into my pocket. I was about to leave when I heard it. A faint rustling in the trees, followed by a low, guttural hum. It wasn't an animal. It sounded human, but wrong. I turned back toward the trail, my heart pounding, and froze. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me. He was tall and thin, dressed in outdated clothes, a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was pale, his features sharp, and his eyes, I couldn't describe them. They seemed to hold something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. "Lost, miss?" he asked, his voice smooth and unsettling. I forced myself to stay calm. "No, just exploring." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This isn't a place for exploring. Not for someone like you." "Someone like me?" I asked, trying to sound braver than I felt. "You don't belong here," he said simply. "But if you've come for answers, I can help. For a price." I didn't trust him, but something about his presence was magnetic. Against my better judgment, I followed him deeper into the woods. He introduced himself as Elias and claimed to know the stories of the Devil's Crossing. He spoke in riddles, hinting at rituals, sacrifices, and deals made with something far older than any human. "They come here to bargain," he said as we approached a hidden cave, "to ask for what they cannot have. Power, fame, love, but the price is always higher than they expect." I felt a pang of unease as we stepped inside. The cave was cold and damp, its walls covered in more of the strange symbols I'd seen earlier. In the center was an altar, rough-hewn stone stained with dark streaks. "What happened to Sarah?" I asked, my voice trembling. "She asked for too much," Elias said, "and she wasn't willing to pay." The cave grew darker, the air heavier. I realized with dawning horror that the shadows on the walls weren't natural. They moved, shifting and writhing like living things. Elias stepped closer, his smile widening. "You've come here for answers, Grace," he said, "and you'll have them. But you must choose. Will you take the truth, or will you leave with your ignorance intact?" "I just want to know what happened to her," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The shadows surged toward me and I stumbled back. Elias's face twisted, his features elongating, his eyes burning with an otherworldly light. "The truth comes at a cost," he hissed. "Will you pay it?" My instinct screamed at me to run, but my curiosity held me rooted in place. I grabbed my voice recorder and pressed play, letting Elias's earlier words loop back at him. The distortion seemed to confuse him, his form flickering like a dying flame. Taking my chance, I bolted out of the cave, the shadows clawing at my heels. The forest seemed to close in around me, the air thick with whispers and guttural growls. I tripped and fell, scraping my hands on the rough ground, but I forced myself to keep going. When I finally burst out of the woods into the sunlight, I collapsed, gasping for air. Behind me, the clearing was empty. No shadows, no Elias, just silence. I didn't stop to collect my things. I drove away from Salt Fork that afternoon, leaving behind my campsite and everything I'd brought with me. The locket was still in my pocket, its weight a constant reminder of what I'd seen. I never released the episode about Sarah. The locket sits in a drawer, too disturbing to display but too important to throw away. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear whispers outside my RV, soft and insistent. And sometimes I dream of Elias's burning eyes and the choices he offered me. I don't know if I made the right decision, but one thing is certain. The Devil's Crossing isn't just a legend, and some answers aren't worth the cost. My name is Henry Walker, and I'm 41 years old. This happened 2 summers ago, in the middle of July, when I drove my RV into Hocking Hills State Park in Ohio. I was on a journey to rediscover myself, a cliché that sounds better on paper than it feels in practice. After my wife passed away 2 years ago, I threw myself into work until I couldn't anymore. Then I quit, sold most of my belongings, and bought an RV. Traveling and photography were supposed to be my therapy. It was supposed to be just another stop on my trip, a chance to photograph Old Man's Cave, a place I'd read about online. The cliffs and caves were stunning in the pictures, and I thought they'd look even better through my lens. But Hocking Hills didn't want me there. I realize that now. The first day went smoothly enough. I arrived around midday, parked my RV at a campground near Old Man's Cave, and spent the afternoon wandering the main trails. The scenery was breathtaking. Towering sandstone cliffs, waterfalls trickling into emerald pools, and the famous caves themselves, gaping and mysterious. The light filtering through the trees gave the place an almost ethereal quality, and I was excited to capture it on camera. As the sun set, I returned to my RV to review the day's photos. That's when I noticed something strange. In one shot, taken near the entrance to Old Man's Cave, there was a shadowy figure in the background. It was faint, just a tall, humanoid silhouette, but it definitely wasn't supposed to be there. I zoomed in, but the more I looked at it, the less sense it made. I chalked it up to a trick of the light or a smudge on my lens. That night, I didn't sleep well. The campground was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like something's watching you. I kept telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me, but I couldn't shake the unease. The next morning, I headed back to the trails, determined to explore more of the caves. That's when I met Jim Hadley, a park ranger who looked like he'd been working there since before I was born. His uniform was worn, his face deeply lined, and his eyes carried a weight I couldn't place. "You here for the caves?" he asked as I adjusted my camera strap. "Yeah," I replied. "I'm a photographer. Thought I'd try to get some shots of the less crowded areas." Jim frowned. "Stick to the main trails," he said firmly. "The caves go deeper than most folks realize. Easy to get turned around, especially near sundown." "I'll be careful," I assured him, but his expression didn't change. "The caves don't like visitors," he muttered before walking away. I should have listened. Later that afternoon, I met Mara. I'd stopped at a gas station just outside the park to grab some snacks, and there she was, leaning against a beat-up car, lighting a cigarette. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, with a sharp, fox-like face and a confident air that didn't match her surroundings. "You heading back to the park?" she asked, catching me off guard. "Yeah, why?" I'm camping there too. My car's acting up. Think you could give me a lift? She pointed to a backpack on the ground. I'll make it worth your while. I know the caves like the back of my hand. I hesitated. There's something about her didn't sit right, but curiosity got the better of me. All right, I said. Hop in. Mara was talkative on the drive back, peppering me with questions about my photography and travels. She claimed to be a geology student researching the caves, but something about her story didn't add up. Still, she seemed harmless enough. Back at the park, she offered to show me a hidden part of the cave system. Most people don't even know it's there, she said with a sly smile. You'll get some killer shots. I hesitated. Jim's warning echoed in my head, but Mara was insistent. Come on, she urged. You said you wanted unique photos, right? This is your chance. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We entered the caves late in the afternoon, well past the areas marked on the map. The main trails gave way to narrow passages, their walls slick with moisture and covered in strange carvings. Spirals, crude stick figures, and symbols I didn't recognize. Old native stuff, Mara said casually, running her fingers over a spiral. Probably warnings. Warnings about what? I asked. She shrugged. Who knows, spirits, curses, whatever scared them back then. As we went deeper, the air grew colder, and the light from my headlamp seemed to struggle against the darkness. Mara pressed on, unfazed, but I was starting to feel uneasy. The walls seemed to close in, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of our footsteps. Then I heard it. A low, guttural moan. Faint, but unmistakable. What was that? I whispered. Probably just the wind, Mara said, but she didn't sound convinced. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The moans turned into whispers, overlapping and echoing off the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to come from every direction at once. My heart pounded as I tried to keep up with Mara. Then I saw it. A shadow moved at the edge of my headlamp's beam, tall and thin, with impossibly long limbs. It disappeared before I could focus on it, but I knew it wasn't my imagination. Mara, we need to go, I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Relax, she said, but her tone was sharper now, almost irritated. It's just the caves playing tricks on you. No, I insisted. There's something down here. She turned to face me, her expression unreadable in the dim light. The caves like you, Henry, she said softly. They want you to stay. That's when I realized she wasn't leading me to safety. She was leading me deeper, toward whatever was waiting in the darkness. Why are you doing this? I demanded, backing away from her. She tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. You're the one who wanted to see the real caves. This is what they are. Before I could respond, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar, and the figure I'd seen earlier stepped into the light. It was no longer a shadow. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It moved with an unnatural grace, its limbs too long, its fingers ending in sharp points. Mara didn't run, she didn't scream. She simply stepped aside, as if offering me up to the creature. I bolted. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. The walls seemed to shift around me, the passages looping back on themselves. The creature's footsteps echoed behind me, slow and deliberate, like it was toying with me. Desperate, I pulled out my camera and started firing the flash blindly into the darkness. The light seemed to disorient it, buying me a few precious seconds. I stumbled into a larger chamber and spotted an opening ahead, the faint glow of daylight. I ran for it, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. Behind me, the whispers grew louder, mingling with the creature's guttural growls. I burst out of the cave into the blinding sunlight, collapsing on the ground. For a moment, everything was silent, and I thought I was safe. Then I heard footsteps behind me. It was Jim. He knelt beside me, his face grim. "I told you to stay on the trails," he said quietly, helping me to my feet. I looked back at the cave entrance, half expecting the creature to follow, but there was nothing there, only darkness. I left Hocking Hills that day, vowing never to return. I deleted every photo I'd taken of the caves, but the memories linger. Sometimes I still hear the whispers in my dreams, calling me back. And sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see Mara standing behind me, smiling that same eerie smile. My name is Ethan Monroe, and I'm 31 years old. 2 years ago, I nearly lost my life, and maybe my sanity, while researching local folklore for my podcast. I've always prided myself on being a rational thinker, someone who could separate fact from fiction. But what happened in Great Seal State Park still keeps me awake at night. I thought I was chasing a story, but something in those woods was chasing me. I'd been running a small podcast called Forgotten Roads, where I explored obscure legends and historical oddities across the U.S. My audience was modest, but loyal. When I stumbled on rumors of the shadow spirit tied to Great Seal State Park, I knew I'd found the perfect topic. Hikers disappearing, strange figures spotted on the trails, whispers of ancient curses. What better way to grab my listeners' attention? The drive to the park was uneventful, just miles of open road and autumn trees. I arrived late in the afternoon, parking my RV near a trailhead. The air was crisp, the sun sinking low over the hills. It felt peaceful, the kind of quiet I needed after months of city noise. I grabbed my recording gear and set up camp, planning to spend 2 nights there. The first sign of trouble came early. As I tested my recorder, my voice came through clear at first, but as I played it back, faint whispers crept in beneath my words. I rewound it, adjusting the volume, but the whispers were too quiet to make out. Just interference, I told myself. These things happen in the woods. I deleted the file and moved on. The first night was cold, but uneventful. I sat by the campfire jotting notes for my podcast. Stories about a shadow spirit that followed hikers fascinated me, but I dismissed the supernatural angle. I assumed the disappearances were due to dangerous terrain or reckless campers. Legends were just old stories, nothing more. Still, as the fire burned low, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows cast by the flames seemed to stretch unnaturally far into the woods. I convinced myself it was exhaustion and turned in for the night. The next morning, I set out on the park's longest trail, hoping to find inspiration for my recording. The trees towered above me, their leaves a riot of red and gold. The path twisted and turned, growing steeper as I ascended a ridge. About halfway up, I noticed a structure hidden in the trees, a small weathered shelter. Curious, I approached. The roof had partially caved in and the wood was gray with age. Inside, I found an old notebook lying open on the dirt floor. Its pages were filled with frantic, scrawled handwriting. Phrases like, "It watches," and "Don't turn your back," leapt out at me. Symbols I didn't recognize, circles with intersecting lines, were drawn in the margins. Beside the notebook lay a handheld audio recorder, dusty but intact. I pressed play, and a woman's voice crackled through the speaker. "My name is Sarah," she said, her tone sharp with fear. "If you're hearing this, you need to leave. There's something here. It doesn't let you leave." I shivered, despite the sunlight filtering through the trees. Sarah's voice continued, growing more desperate with each recording. She described a dark figure that followed her through the park, always just out of sight. She'd found the shelter hoping to escape, but the figure never left her alone. The final entry was a scream, cut short by static. By the time I left the shelter, the air had grown colder, the sun sinking lower. I hadn't realized how much time I'd spent listening to Sarah's recordings. As I descended the ridge, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. Back at camp, I played the recordings again, searching for clues. Sarah's fear was palpable, but there was no concrete evidence of anything supernatural. I was ready to dismiss it as paranoia until I stepped outside to grab firewood. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the tree line, a figure stood motionless. It was humanoid, but impossibly tall, its body cloaked in shadow. My heart hammered as I blinked, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. When I looked again, it was gone. I barely slept that night. The shadows outside seemed alive, shifting with every flicker of the campfire. Around 2 a.m., I heard faint whispers again. This time, they weren't coming from my recorder. They were coming from the woods. The whispers grew louder, forming words. "Ethan!" I froze. My name echoed through the trees, soft but unmistakable. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but the beam only revealed the thick trunks of trees. My breath fogged in the cold air, and the whispers stopped. The next day, I decided to leave early. Whatever was happening here wasn't worth the podcast. But as I packed up my gear, I noticed something horrifying. Symbols, the same ones from Sarah's notebook, had been etched into the side of my RV. My heart sank as I realized my keys were missing. I tore through my belongings, but they were nowhere to be found. Panic set in. I grabbed my gear and started walking, determined to find help. The main trail should have led back to the park entrance, but no matter how far I walked, I couldn't find my way out. The trees seemed to close in around me, the paths twisting and looping back to the same spots. As the day wore on, the shadow appeared again. This time, it was closer, standing just yards away. Its head tilted unnaturally, as though studying me. I shouted at it, demanded it leave me alone, but it didn't move. I turned and ran, heart pounding, but the shadow stayed with me, always just out of reach. By dusk, I was back at the shelter. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and my mind raced with fear. The shelter was the only place I felt even remotely safe. As darkness fell, the shadow grew bolder, circling the structure, its presence heavy and suffocating. I replayed Sarah's recordings, searching for answers. Her final words repeated in my head, "Don't turn your back on it. Don't let it touch you." The notebook offered another clue. One page described a grave hidden deep in the woods, marked by wilted flowers. The writer believed the shadow was tied to the grave, its power drawn from the desecration of sacred land. If I could find the grave, maybe I could stop it. The final night was a blur of terror. I waited until the shadow was momentarily out of sight, then sprinted into the woods with nothing but a flashlight and Sarah's notebook. The forest seemed alive, the trees creaking and groaning as if warning me to turn back. The whispers returned, louder now, forming a cacophony of voices. After what felt like hours, I found the grave. It was unmarked, surrounded by dead flowers and broken stones. A single symbol, like the ones from the notebook, was etched into the dirt. My hands shook as I copied the symbol into the earth with a stick, hoping it would weaken the shadow. A low, guttural growl echoed through the woods. The shadow appeared, larger than before, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. It lunged at me, and I barely managed to throw myself out of its path. Desperate, I scratched another symbol into the dirt. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. I didn't stop. I drew symbol after symbol until the shadow let out a deafening roar and vanished, leaving the forest eerily silent. I stumbled back to my RV at sunrise, exhausted and trembling. My keys were lying on the ground as if returned by unseen hands. The engine roared to life on the first try, and I didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road, away from Great Seal State Park. I never released the episode on the shadow spirit. Some things are better left untold. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that it followed me. Sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I see a dark figure, watching, waiting. My name is Evan Carter, and I was 28 when the events I'm about to recount happened. To this day, I haven't set foot in the woods again, and I doubt I ever will. This all took place in the dense forests of Hocking Hills State Park, Ohio, during a weekend camping trip meant to be a celebration. Instead, it turned into a nightmare that still haunts me every time I close my eyes. The idea came from Haley, my friend Jordan's girlfriend. Haley had just wrapped up her first photography exhibit, and she wanted to celebrate by capturing the natural beauty of the Ohio wilderness. Jordan was all for it, and I saw it as a chance to reconnect with my younger sister Beth, who had been distant ever since she moved back to town. So, the four of us packed up for a weekend of camping. It was late October, and the leaves had turned fiery shades of red and orange. The drive to Hocking Hills was pleasant enough, filled with Haley's excitement about capturing perfect long-exposure shots of the night sky and Jordan's usual sarcasm. Beth sat quietly in the back seat, clutching her silver necklace, a family heirloom she never went without. We arrived at the trailhead around mid-afternoon. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the chatter of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. We hiked for an hour before finding a secluded clearing near a stream. It was perfect, or so I thought. As we unpacked, I realized I'd forgotten the poles for the tent. "Damn it," I muttered, kicking myself for the oversight. Jordan laughed it off, as he always did, but Beth was visibly uneasy. Haley suggested we make do with the tarps we'd brought, and we rigged up a makeshift shelter using trees and rope. By the time the sun began to set, we were sitting around a small fire, eating canned chili and trading stories. Haley couldn't stop talking about the photos she planned to take. "This place is amazing," she said, adjusting her camera. "I can't wait to see how the stars look tonight." Beth remained quiet, her eyes darting toward the tree line. "This place feels off," she said softly, "like we're not supposed to be here." "Come on, Beth," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "It's just a forest." It started small. The bird song that had been constant earlier in the day vanished as the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest grew eerily silent, save for the crackling of our fire. While gathering more firewood, Haley called out, "Hey, guys, look at this." We walked over to find her kneeling by the stream, pointing at footprints in the mud. They were human-like but elongated, with clawed toes. "Probably a bear," I said, though I didn't believe it. Jordan laughed nervously. "Yeah, a bear that walks on two legs. Totally normal." Beth looked pale. "We should leave," she whispered. I waved her off. "It's nothing. Let's just enjoy the trip, okay?" But deep down, I felt it too. That creeping sense that we were being watched. As the night deepened, Haley busied herself with her camera, setting up long exposures. The rest of us sat by the fire. That's when we heard it. The sound of my voice calling out from the darkness. "Help!" Jordan sat up straight. "Evan, was that you?" My stomach dropped. "I'm sitting right here." The voice came again, louder this time but distorted, like it was coming through a broken speaker. "Help me!" Beth clutched her necklace tightly. "That's not you," she said, her voice trembling. "It's someone messing with us," I said, grabbing a flashlight. "Stay here." I stepped into the trees, shining the light in all directions. The beam landed on a figure about 20 yards away. It looked like me, but wrong. Its proportions slightly off, its movements jerky and unnatural. My breath caught in my throat as it turned its head, its eyes reflecting the light like an animal's. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. When I returned to the fire, I didn't tell the others what I'd seen. I didn't want to scare them, or myself. The next morning, things got worse. Beth's necklace was missing, and we found it hanging from a branch deep in the forest. Haley's camera, which she'd left outside, had been moved, its lens shattered. Beth refused to leave the campsite, muttering prayers under her breath. Haley, ever the adventurer, insisted on hiking to a nearby overlook for better photos. Jordan and I went with her, leaving Beth alone against her protests. As we climbed the trail, we noticed the forest seemed different. The trees were gnarled and twisted, and the air was thick and heavy, as if the forest itself was pressing down on us. Then we heard the laughter, high-pitched and childlike, echoing through the trees. "Kids?" Haley said, confused. "Out here?" Jordan shook his head. "No way, not this far in." We quickened our pace, but the laughter followed us, growing louder and more mocking. By the time we reached the overlook, we were all on edge. Haley snapped a few photos but kept glancing over her shoulder. I was about to suggest we head back when Jordan froze. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing to a ridge across the valley. Standing there was a figure, gaunt and pale, with elongated limbs. It moved in sharp, unnatural jerks, like a marionette. Haley raised her camera, but the creature vanished before she could take a shot. "Let's go," I said, my voice tight. The hike back was a nightmare. The laughter returned, joined by whispers that sounded like our own voices. The forest seemed to shift around us, the trail disappearing and reappearing in ways that defied logic. When we finally made it back to camp, Beth was gone. Panic set in as we searched the area, calling her name. We found her near the stream, standing motionless. When I touched her shoulder, she turned to face me, her eyes vacant and unseeing. "She's mine now," a voice whispered, though no one else was around. Beth collapsed into my arms, shaking violently. I carried her back to camp, but she wouldn't speak. She just stared into the fire, clutching her necklace. That night, the skinwalker came for us. It stood just beyond the firelight, its twisted form visible in flashes as it circled the camp. It spoke in Beth's voice, then mine, then Jordan's. Each time it sounded more human, more convincing. "It wants one of us," Beth finally said, her voice hollow. "A life for a life." I argued with her, but Beth was resolute. She believed it was her fault for bringing the necklace, for ignoring the warnings she claimed to have felt from the beginning. While the rest of us slept, or pretended to, Beth disappeared. When we woke, she was gone. The forest was silent again, and the air felt lighter, as if whatever had been stalking us was satisfied. We hiked out in a daze, haunted by what we'd seen and heard. When we reached the car, Haley checked her camera. The last photo she'd taken showed the four of us standing at the overlook, only there were 5 figures in the frame. The 5th figure stood behind us, pale and gaunt, its hollow eyes staring directly at the lens. Beth was never found. Search parties combed the area but came up empty. Haley and Jordan broke up not long after, and I stopped camping altogether. Sometimes, late at night, I hear Beth's voice calling to me from the woods outside my window. I don't know if it's real, or if my mind is playing tricks on me, but I'll never answer. The forest can keep its secrets. I want no part of them.